So let me ask you something. When Congress votes to fund a war, approve billions in foreign aid, or sign international agreements that commit American resources overseas, do you believe those decisions are made purely on behalf of the American citizens? Or do you think something else might be influencing them? Because tonight, we're going to talk about something Washington almost never discusses openly: money. And not just any money, foreign lobbying, and the enormous influence that money can create inside our political system. Now, before we go any further, let me say something clearly right up front. This conversation's not about attacking allies. It's not about opposing trade. And it's definitely not about blaming any particular country or group of people. And if you stay with me, later in the episode, you hear exactly why politicians are already getting defensive about this conversation as we reveal the scorecard of Senator Ted Cruz. Because this conversation is about a very simple principle. The United States government exists for one purpose and one purpose only, and that purpose is to serve the people of the United States. American citizens, American workers, American families, and American taxpayers. And if that principle ever starts to become blurry, then citizens have every right to start asking questions. So tonight, we're going to do something very simple. We're going to follow the money. And when you start following the money, some very interesting patterns begin to appear. And later in this episode, we're going to look at something almost nobody in Washington talks about, and that's the economic ecosystem that forms around foreign wars, because once conflict begins, entire industries begin forming around them: defense contracts, energy markets, reconstruction projects, security services. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, you begin to realize that foreign policy decisions often involve far more than just diplomacy. But before we get into all of that, we need to start with a much simpler question. Who is Washington actually working for?
This is not noise. This is not outrage. This is conviction. We believe in faith. We believe in family. We believe in this country and the people who built it. Welcome to What If Unfiltered. This is more than a show. This is a movement.
So you hear the phrase America first, used a lot in politics. For some people, it represents patriotism, and for others, it's become politically charged. But around here, we talk about something slightly different: Americans first. And that means American citizens, American workers, families, veterans, and taxpayers. The idea doesn't belong to a single political party. It doesn't belong to any politician. It belongs to the American people, because the United States government once again exists for one primary purpose, and that's only to serve the people of the United States, not foreign governments, not global corporations, not lobbyists, just Americans. So when you begin looking at foreign money flowing into Washington, that principle suddenly becomes incredibly important. So let's start with something that surprises a lot of people. Let's attack this through the eyes of an everyday citizen. You're working 40 hours a week, maybe 50, maybe 60. You're paying taxes every year. You're trying to pay off your mortgage, maybe trying to save for your kids' college, maybe trying to put money away for retirement. And then you start hearing about the massive amount of foreign aid going overseas, tens of billions of dollars. And naturally, you ask yourself, how could that money have been spent here? For American infrastructure, veterans returning home, American manufacturing, for reducing the national debt. These aren't radical questions. They're the kinds of questions ordinary citizens start asking when they see the scale of government spending. And asking those questions doesn't mean someone wants to have America withdraw from the world. It simply means people want to know whether American citizens are still the top priority, because we certainly don't feel like it anymore. Tell me if you agree with me. Later on, we'll break down what that massive amount of money could have been put to use for the benefit of American citizens. So make sure you stay until the end. So let's talk about the scale of foreign money. And most Americans would probably assume foreign governments have very limited influence over our political system, although one recently keeps popping up over and over again. But the reality is it's a little more complicated. Foreign-connected political action committees poured more than $21 million into the 2024 election cycle. Foreign interests. Why are they putting money into our elections? Now, when people hear a number like that, the first assumption is usually that it all went to one political party. But that's not what happened. About 58% went to the Republican candidates, and about 42% went to Democrats, which tells you something important right away. This isn't really a partisan issue at all. It's a systemic one. Foreign agents registered under Foreign Agents Registration Act, commonly referred to as FARA, donated more than $14 million to political campaigns in recent election cycles. And the lobbying number, it's freaking out of control. Saudi Arabia alone has spent nearly $57 million lobbying Washington. Then you have China-linked interests having spent more than $54 million. And then when you add in countries like Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and South Korea, you begin to see something interesting. Washington has become one of the most powerful influence marketplaces in the entire world. Now, technically, foreign governments cannot donate directly to American campaigns. It's illegal. But the reality is that money still finds ways to flow, whether it's through subsidiaries, lobbying firms, super PACs, through complicated political spending networks. And if this is your first time watching the show, go back a couple of videos and take a look at our dark money and our billionaire networks, and you'll get a better understanding of those complicated political spending networks. And when you start pulling on those threads, you begin to see how influence actually works. I'd love to know what you think about this. Drop me a comment below and let me know your thoughts. How did this make you feel? How compromised do you think our system is? So let's discuss how lobbying really works. And I would imagine most people imagine lobbying as a handful of people in suits walking into congressional offices and making arguments about policy. But modern lobbying is far more sophisticated than that. Today, it operates as a complete influence ecosystem. You have registered lobbyists who meet directly with lawmakers. You have super PACs capable of spending unlimited amounts of money. Then you have think tanks publishing policy reports that shape public debate, aka flood the airwaves with false narratives and incite emotions. You have campaign bunglers gathering all sorts of campaign donations. And then you have the revolving door. Former members of Congress, former military leaders, former government officials, many of them leave public service and quickly move into lobbying positions. You ask why? Well, because they're the same people who once wrote the rules, who knows the system better. But now they work in industries designed to massage those rules. And they're making 1,400% more as a lobbyist than a member of Congress. So it begs the question, what do they do to get paid like that? Now, that doesn't automatically mean corruption, but it does mean something important. Foreign government and foreign interests now have access to one of the most sophisticated influencing networks ever created. Someone tell me how taking any foreign money supports an American's first agenda. But the influence doesn't stop there, because in many cases, it intersects with something even larger. War. So stay with me, because in a few seconds, you'll see a number most people, once they see it, will never, ever unsee it. Now, this is where the conversation starts to get even more serious, because foreign policy decisions don't just affect diplomacy. They affect money, a ton of money. And guess what? Once again, it's not partisans. Both parties have fed the beast. Over the past 25 years, the United States has fought major military conflicts all across the Middle East. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. You can now add Iran to the list. And that's in addition to numerous counter-terror operations that cross a multiple of regions. According to Brown University's Costs of War project, those conflicts have cost the United States more than $8 trillion when you include long-term care for veterans and interest on the borrowed money. $8 trillion. Now, I want you to pause for a second and think about that number. $8 trillion. It's such a large number that most people can't even visualize it. Another way of saying it is, imagine if you spent $1 million every single day. It still would take you more than 21,000 years to spend $8 trillion. That's the scale we're talking about. And most of that money wasn't paid for through taxes at the time. Get this, it was borrowed, which means the bill is still coming due. America's national debt has now crossed $38 trillion, and the interest payments alone are approaching $1 trillion every year. Think about this for a second. We are now borrowing money to pay interest on money we've already borrowed. If it isn't obvious to you, then let me explain the impact. The interest alone is growing at around $30,000 per second. That's $30,000. That's $30,000. There goes another $30,000. $100,000 in interest with the snap of a finger. And we're running around the world acting like we're rich when we're actually broke. Now, I'm not calling for us to be isolationists. I'm not even saying that every single one of those conflicts was unnecessary. But when the financial costs reach into the trillions, we deserve to know how those decisions are made. And that leads us directly into something often gets overlooked in discussions about war: the economic ecosystem that forms around us. And this will blow your mind, because war is big business, huge. That's right, war is big business. But most of us think about war strictly in military terms. How many troops? What's the strategy? What's the diplomacy? What's our exit strat? We think about bombs, who has more? But war also creates enormous economic activity. Defense contractors receive massive contracts to produce equipment and weapon systems. Energy markets shift dramatically dependent on regional stability. You're seeing it right now. Private security companies expand their operations. Logistics companies move equipment and personnel around the globe. And eventually, when conflict begins winding down, oh boy, reconstruction begins. Infrastructure projects, construction contracts, engineering firms, technology companies, billions, sometimes trillions of dollars begin flowing into rebuilding efforts. Look at the picture of total destruction of Gaza. Looks more like Nagasaki to me than it does like a combat zone. And I've seen a combat zone. But then look at Jared Kushner's vision of what it might be able to be. Do you still question if war is big business? I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. Take a look at that. But that doesn't mean wars are started for economic reasons. But it also doesn't mean they're not. But it does mean that once war begins, the entire financial ecosystem grows around them and they get their checkbooks ready. And when that much money is involved, powerful interest inevitably becomes connected to the outcome. That's simply the reality of large-scale geopolitical conflict, but this is where the conversation becomes personal for many Americans. Hey, let me stop for a second. I'm curious what you think. Do you believe foreign money should be allowed to influence American policy decisions, or should that money be completely removed from our political system? I believe it should be removed. Tell me if you agree with me. Put their thoughts in the comments, because the conversation only works when citizens are involved. So now we're going to discuss the big elephant, AIPAC, and foreign policy lobbying. But before we go any further, I want to take a moment to clarify something, because conversations like this can easily be misunderstood if they're not framed correctly. This discussion is not about attacking any country. It's not about attacking people. And it's definitely not about attacking religion. The United States has alliances all over the world: Israel, Saudi Arabia, European allies, Asian allies. Strategic partnerships are a normal part of global diplomacy. And many of those relationships have real strategic value. But at the same time, every country in the world advances for its own national interests. That's what companies do. That's what they should do. Heck, that's what we want our political employees to do on our behalf. But when foreign policy decisions are being made in Washington, it's reasonable for American citizens to ask a simple question. Are those decisions being made with American citizens as your top priority? Because that's the principle we've been talking about all throughout this episode. Americans first. Citizens, veterans, workers, retirees, families, taxpayers. That principle doesn't mean isolating ourselves from the world. It simply means that the United States government should ultimately serve we, the people of the United States. And when you start to look at how lobbying works in Washington, one of the most visible examples of foreign policy advocacy is an organization called AIPAC. AIPAC stands for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. It was founded in the 1950s to supposedly strengthen the relationship between the United States and Israel. It's funded supposedly by American citizens and operates legally as a domestic lobbying organization. So under those terms, it's important to understand that it's not a foreign government entity under current U.S. law. But there's many who question if it should be, because there's a ton of noise out there and there's so many people that disagree. But the scale of political spending surrounding pro-Israel advocacy has grown significantly in recent years. You have super PACs aligned with that movement have spent well over $100 million supporting candidates Israel or the Israeli investors believe will support a strong U.S.-Israel alliance. AIPAC boasts a 96 to 98% win rate in the campaigns they back. Now, I want you to stop and think about that for a second. What else do you know can boast a 96 to 98% win rate? Think about that and then ask yourself, why is an Israel First group funding American campaigns? But again, lobbying itself is not unusual. Energy companies, defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, labor unions, they all lobby. That's simply part of the American political system. But if you ask me, it's the broken part of the system. But when you start looking at the campaign finance data, you can see which lawmakers have received the largest amounts of political support connected to these foreign policy advocacy networks. For example, in recent election cycles, some of the top recipients of pro-Israel political spending have included members on both political parties. And just to give you a sense of scale, here's a few examples from our scorecard research. Looking at this, you can clearly see why politicians want to hide this data, because it's really hard to look at this, realize it's from Israeli investors, and somehow come away saying, oh yeah, that's Americans first. But this is exactly why we created the Citizen Scorecard, because allegiance matters. Stick with me, because in a minute we're going to expose who sits on the foreign relations committees and how many of those representatives and senators take foreign money. But am I the only one that thinks that is the textbook definition of conflict of interest? Think about it. Politicians taking mounds of foreign money from people who guarantee their place in D.C. with a 96 to 98% win rate, serving on foreign relations committees for the benefit of not America, foreign countries. And when voters see that level of spending surrounding international issues, they naturally begin asking questions. Who benefits from these policies? Who influences these decisions? And ultimately, are American citizens still the top priority? But the weird thing is, if you ask those questions and it's about AIPAC, you're immediately labeled anti-Semite just for asking questions such as, what do the American people get for that money? Why do we spend so much money on Israel when we're drowning in debt and they actually have a better standard of living than we do? Those are fair questions. What's up with the attacks? On a personal note, just so everybody understands where I'm coming from, my grandfather was Jewish. My great-grandmother was Jewish. Heck, my grandfather's name was Abraham. So I'm not attacking the Jewish people. I would never do that. I care too much about them. I've actually gone to temple with my grandfather and my great-grandmother to celebrate Jewish holidays together. So the last thing that I am is anti-Semite. But the first thing I am is I'm an American. And as an American, I have the right to ask questions about how U.S. tax dollars are being spent. Because we keep going back to the principle we've talked about earlier. It still matters. The United States government was created to serve the people of the United States. Citizens, families, Americans first. That's the standard. That's it. There is no other standard. And this is why the committees that control American foreign policy become so important. So let's talk about where many of these decisions actually take shape. We have two congressional committees holding enormous influence over American foreign policy. The first one is the House Representatives that have the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the second one are our senators and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. These committees help shape decisions about foreign aid, military alliances, sanctions, arms deals, diplomatic relationships. Members of these committees often receive significant campaign contributions from organizations involved in foreign policy lobbying. Again, somehow that's legal. But it raises questions about conflicts of interest, because in almost every other profession, conflicts of interest require transparency. Think about it. Judges recuse themselves from cases where financial interests exist. Corporate executives have to disclose financial relationships, but in Washington, lawmakers can participate directly in shaping foreign policy while receiving campaign funding from organizations advocating specific policies. Even when everything's legal, the optics alone create concerns for so many citizens, and those concerns lead us into something deeper. A growing gap between citizens and the institutions meant to represent them. Earlier in the episode, we talked about a question that many Americans are starting to ask. What could that $8 trillion have done here for Americans? Now, we've looked at the numbers, and that question becomes even more powerful. Think about it for a moment. Even a fraction of that money could have dramatically changed the financial future of this country. Imagine what a measly 10% of that amount could have done. Debt reduction, infrastructure modernization, veterans care, investment in American manufacturing. Now listen, I get these decisions aren't easy decisions. Foreign policy is complicated. You got to balance it and find the sweet spot. But when citizens see numbers like this, is it not natural for them to ask whether American priorities are being placed first, second, third, last? Let me ask you a question. Please respond in the comments below. I would really love to hear from you on this. If you were in Congress, what would you prioritize spending that money on here at home? Love to hear it. Before we continue, let's take a quick step back for a moment. If you believe Americans deserve transparency, accountability, and real data about people running our country, make sure you follow and subscribe to the show. And if you want to go deeper than the conversations we have here, you can join our community on Patreon. Just click on the link in the episode description. That's where members get access to the Citizens Warrior Score reports, including the full Senate scorecards, the nonpartisan analytical comparisons, and the foreign influence report. Because informed citizens make stronger democracies. They make better decisions. You can find the link in the description, and I appreciate every single one of you helping us grow this movement. Now, let's get back to the show. So, how does foreign influence serve the American people? Because if that question can't be answered clearly, then citizens have every right to ask why. And this is why we created something called the Citizen Scorecard. The idea is so simple. If elected officials work for the American people, if we begin to see them as employees instead of celebrities, their job performance should be transparent to the American people. Our scorecard evaluates leaders across several categories because citizens deserve the ability to see how their representatives are performing, just like every other job in this country. Tonight, we're introducing a new segment on the show. It's called the Citizen Scorecard of the Week. Every week, we evaluate one member of Congress using a standardized performance framework that we call the Citizen Score. This framework examines legislative behavior, financial incentives, and policy outcomes across multiple measurable categories. No party, no rhetoric, just performance. The Citizen Score evaluates politicians across several pillars, including domestic economic policy, financial impact of legislation, foreign influence exposure, campaign funding sources, attendance and legislative participation, financial integrity, and veteran support. Each category receives a score from 0 to 100, and those scores combine to produce the final citizen score. Once the citizen score is calculated, it's then evaluated through what we call the American's First Test. This test asks a simple question. When policy decisions are made in Washington, do those decisions primarily serve Americans? If the overall score reaches 80 or above, the official passes the American's First Test. Scores between 70 and 79 require improvement, and anything below 70 fails the framework. Tonight's evaluation examines the record of Senator Ted Cruz from Texas. When we run Senator Cruz through the Citizen Score framework, the results are mixed. His overall citizen score came in at 65 out of 100. Now, breaking down the categories, domestic economic policy scored 75. That places it in the requires improvement range. Financial impact of legislation scored only a 55. Foreign influence exposure scored a mere 45. And money in politics scored 60. However, several categories performed strongly. Senator Cruz maintains a 97% attendance rate in Senate voting, which is a strong performance indicator. We know he shows up for work. His financial integrity score ranked at 85, and his legislative record on veteran support reached a passing threshold of 80. But we do have two areas that raise significant concern within the framework. First, large donor influence. When we look at his numbers and we look at the disclosures, his campaign finance disclosures showed a substantial share of funding tied to major political donors and political action committees. Again, there's nothing illegal about this, but it does raise a structural question that voters deserve to understand. When large financial contributors play a major role in campaign funding, it becomes important to ask, who ultimately shapes the policy agenda? Voters or the financial networks that help power the elections? Our second red flag was foreign policy lobbying influence, and publicly available campaign finance data shows meaningful support connected to foreign policy advocacy networks. Again, we're not alleging any wrongdoing, but when financial support is tied to organizations whose missions focus on foreign policy priorities, it creates an important accountability question. Are policy decisions being evaluated through the lens of American national interest or through the strategic interests of outside actors? And that question is exactly why this category exists within the Citizen Score framework. Now, once those pillars are combined into the final score, the end result is evaluated through the Americans First test. This framework asks whether legislative decisions consistently align with the interest of American citizens. And as with the Citizen Score, the scoring works exact same way. If the final score reaches 80 or higher, the senator passes the test. 70-79 requires improvement, and anything below 70 fails. When Senator Ted Cruz's final score is run through the Americans First test, his citizen score of 65 fails below the passing threshold. Under the framework used in this evaluation, unfortunately, Senator Ted Cruz receives a fail. Now, it's important to say this clearly. This scorecard has nothing to do with party. It's not about personality, and it's not even about ideology. It's about alignment between public policy decisions and the interest of American citizens. That's the standard we're applying. And it's the same exact standard we'll apply to every elected official that we evaluate on this show. That's our promise. And next week, we're going to examine the Citizen Scorecard of another powerful figure in Washington, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. How does his legislative record perform under the Americans First framework? And will his score pass the test? We'll reveal that next week. Now, that brings us back to the question we started the night with. When decisions are made in Washington, who are our leaders really answering to? The voters or the money? Because influence only works when citizens stop paying attention, when voters stop asking questions, when politicians believe no one is watching. That's why this show exists. Not to tell you what to think, but to shine light where power and money intersect. Because sovereignty doesn't belong to the politicians, it belongs to the people. And that's the standard, that's the mission, and that's why accountability matters. Before we wrap up tonight, there's one more thing. Next week, we're going to look at something that might make a lot of Americans uncomfortable. The extraordinary wealth many politicians accumulate while serving in public office. Because public office was never supposed to be a path to personal enrichment. Yet, over time, some elected officials enter the office with modest finances, then receive a $174,000 per year salary, and somehow they leave with multi-million-dollar net worths. So the question we're going to ask next week is simple. What if public service has quietly become one of the most profitable careers in America? And once you start looking at the numbers, some very interesting patterns begin to appear. So make sure you're subscribed, because that episode is going to raise some questions a lot of people in Washington would probably prefer not to answer. As always, remember, iron sharpens iron, stay strong, always put Americans first, and let's get unfiltered.
These conversations don't end when the episode does. They carry forward into how we think, how we speak, and how we engage the world around us. Here, we don't demand agreement. We ask for honesty. We don't chase outrage. We pursue clarity. Because better questions shape better conversations, and better conversations shape better outcomes for our families, our communities, and our country. If this episode sharpened your thinking, share it, continue the conversation, and let's get unfiltered. Until next time, this is What If Unfiltered, where conviction is rooted in faith, guided by tradition, and focused on the future.